I'm going to start by removing the hubcap. If you can't pull it off with your fingers, you can use a little pry bar. Just be very careful not to break the hubcap or damage the rim. Take a 21mm socket and remove all 5 of your lug nuts, and then remove the wheel. Now you can go through the center of this caliper right here with a little pry bar or screwdriver and just pry the caliper forward or towards the outside of the car. That's just going to squeeze the piston in a little bit, give this a little bit more play so that you can take it off easier. So now with a 14mm, let's remove both of these bolts. Take the caliper off and set it right on top of the knuckle here, or you can tie it with a bungee cord. Just make sure that there's no pressure on the brake hose. Now you can remove the pads. With a 17mm socket, I'm going to break both of these free. And remove them all the way. Okay, leave this one in a few threads. Let's do the top one. Finish removing the bottom. And here is your caliper bracket. Now you can remove the rotor if it's stuck on like this one. Let's put a lug nut back on. Now with the lug nut on, you can hammer between the studs here. That's going to break the rotor free off the hub. There we go. Take your safety lug nut off. It did its job. Now you can remove the rotor. At this point, you want to clean the surface of the hub. You can use a wire brush and just scrub it. Make sure there are no raised areas. You want the rotor to sit nice and flush on the hub. Or you could use a sanding disc like this if your surface is pretty bad like mine. In the next clip, you'll actually see a new hub because I'm replacing it, but basically what you would want to do is sand it down, make sure it's as clean as possible. You have no raised areas, it's all smooth, it's all rust free, and then we'll coat it so it doesn't rust again like this. Now let's apply some anti-seize to the surface of the hub. Try to wipe it off the lug studs if you got some on there. Now grab your rotor, and I like to install it backwards first. That way I can clean off the surface. It's got oil from the factory, and you want to take those oils off. You don't want them getting on your brake pads. So spray it down with some brake parts cleaner and wipe it off with a rag. There you go. Make sure it's clean. As you can see, it wasn't. Now flip it over, install it the right way. Let's clean off this outer surface as well. Now let's clean up our caliper bracket and install that onto the vehicle. Now with my caliper bracket on my workbench here, I'm going to start by pulling out these slider pins. Looks like this one's pretty stuck in here, but it's still moving, so that's a good sign. Oh, there we go, it freed up. Sometimes they get seized up. So I'm going to do these one at a time because you'll notice one of them will have a little rubber piece on it. That's this one right here. And I'm going to wipe off the old grease. Of course, these are not rotted or anything. If they were, you'd want to either replace them or clean them up if they're decent. But this one's okay. I want to clean up in this ridge here. It's important because that's where the boot seals up, and if you have rust, that's going to let water get in. And I'm just going to wipe off the edge of the boot here. Get the little rust crusties off. The rest of it is clean. Usually if they were very dirty inside or dried up, you'd take a bore brush with some brake parts cleaner, put it in there and clean it up. This one's all right, so all I'm going to do is add grease to it now that I've cleaned it up. So I'm going to take a little bit of extra grease and pack it into this boot here. This is going to act as a reserve of grease for the slider pin, and whatever else I have on my brush, I'm just going to lubricate the slider pin, cover it with grease, and it's important that you get up in that ridge there. Again, like I mentioned earlier, that's where the boot seals up, and if you don't have grease in there and it's dry, the boot will not seal up as well as if you did have grease. So make sure you apply grease to the whole thing. Work this one into the ridges here and slide in your pin. Okay, you hear the air come out. That's exactly what you want. A lot of times the air will get trapped back here or into the boot, and what you can do at that point is press it, squeeze the boot, and that's going to release pretty much all the air that's stuck there. That way this sits nice and flush. Give it a couple twists to make sure that the grease works its way all around in there. Perfect. Let's do the same to this side over here. You'll notice this one does not have the rubber piece, and I didn't want to mix them up. That's why I did them one at a time, because it's there for a reason and it should go back to where it belongs. So clean this side up as well. We'll re-grease it and then we'll move on. Wipe off the excess grease. Give this a couple twists. That feels perfect right there. Now let's flip the caliper bracket sideways and let's clean up these areas right here where the anti-rattle clips sit. You can pull these off. Sometimes you'll need a small pry bar or a screwdriver. Well, these are pretty stuck in here. There goes one of them. Let's do the same to the rest, and we'll clean them all up. Okay. I'm just going to take all 4 off at the same time. That way I can do all of the cleaning at the same time. And basically you want to clean underneath it. Otherwise the new pads will be squished between the 2 ends because there's rust buildup and you'll have braking issues down the road. So definitely make sure this is all clean. Now what you can do here, if yours wasn't as bad as mine, you can just use a wire brush and brush this off. And it might seem like it's cleaning up well, but there's still some raised areas in here with rust, so I want to take those off. I'm going to use a cutting disc. I'm going to be very careful when I do this because obviously I don't want to cut into this material here, but I just want to scrape the surface. You can use some sandpaper if you have, or screwdriver, pry bar, whatever you have. Basically you want this nice and clean to take off all of this debris that's stuck there. Okay, this looks pretty good to me. Let's lubricate it. Just gonna clean off the areas here, get all the dust out, and once it's all dried up, just put a thin layer of brake grease here. That's going to help rust, well, it's going to prevent rust from building up. It's going to help it not build up in the future, which is exactly what you want. You don't want any rust, but you also don't want too much grease, otherwise it'll squish out from underneath the anti-rattle clips onto the rotor, and then you have grease on your brakes, and that's not good. So keep in mind, a thin layer is all you need here. Now take your new anti-rattle clips, and it's important to note that the spring, I guess I should have mentioned it earlier, but the spring goes towards the inner part of the bracket here. So this is the spring right here, and of course with the hook on the spring towards the outside, you don't want anything protruding into the middle here. That's where the rotor goes. So basically line those up and press them down all the way. They should slide right on. If they don't, maybe you didn't clean up the bracket enough, maybe you have the wrong side. So just keep that in mind. Basically, these should slide right on. There we go. Okay, these are pressed down all the way. So now we're ready to install our caliper bracket back onto the vehicle. Take your caliper bracket, slide it over the rotor, line it up with the bolt holes. Take your bolts, and I put some blue thread locker on these. If you're gonna put anything, put thread locker. Definitely do not put any C's on your brake bolts. So slide these on. All right, let's bottom these out and then torque them to 101 foot-pounds. Okay, when you get the pads in, you want to note that the kit will come with a little wear indicator that you want to attach to the pads, and I like to put it on the bottom of the inner pad. That's going to be the drag side. So basically what I mean by that is the rotor is going to spin and drag this little clip out, make some noise. If you put it on the top, it's going to shove it into itself as it's dragging along the rotor. So that's how you know that you need new brakes. The outer pad does not get one of these, so I'm just going to slide this one in. That way it's not in my hands anymore. And this might be a little tricky finding the right angle that it wants to slide in at, but once you find it, it should be easy enough. Okay, there we go. And now for this inner pad, I'm going to take my wear indicator, and it hooks on right on the ear, on the end here. Kind of swoop it around like this and then press it on, just like that. Slide the pad on. There we go. Once you have them in, make sure they move freely. If they don't, that means you didn't clean up the bracket enough and they're stuck here. These move very freely, so that's perfect. Next, take your brake caliper, and in order to install it over the new pads, we're going to have to depress this piston and push it back in. You can do this with different things. I like to use this special caliper depression tool for it, but you can use some large pliers or whatever you have. And basically, what your goal is to push this piston back in slowly. This is not a race here. You want to go slow, push it all the way back in to accommodate for the extra thickness of the new pads. So just push it in all the way until it bottoms out. If you don't have a tool like this, you can use some large pliers. Again, whatever you have, that'll do the job. The key is to go slow. Now that this is done, I'll remove my tool, and now we can apply some grease on this outer ring of the piston, as well as on these two ears here. What that's going to do is it's going to allow the pads to operate quietly and smoothly. So a very thin layer, you don't need a lot. And I'll put a little bit on these two ears here for the same reason. There we go. Now take your caliper, flip it over, and install it onto the bracket. Make sure it goes over the slider pins and lines up with the two bolt holes. Take your bolts and start them in. Make sure you start both of these by hand. These are very easy to cross thread. I'm just going to go ahead and bottom them out since they turn so easily. And now let's torque them. Let's torque these to 25 foot-pounds. Now do the same thing to the other side. Pump up the brakes and let's put the wheel back on. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 76 foot-pounds. Let's not forget about the hubcap, and if you are putting these on, if you have them, make sure that this cutout goes over your valve stem, otherwise you'll ruin it. So these are going to be a little tricky to install. You have to hold them in several different places, and they keep wanting to pop off. There we go. Perfect.